as living, breathing, growing human beings, we all like companionship, right? Well, guess what? There's another group of living, breathing, growing things that also like companions. Guess what they are? Plants. Many of my Facebook friends and YouTube followers, subscribers may know that I really enjoy something called companion planting. In last year's videos, I actually showed a few and explained why I was doing that. But recently on my personal Facebook group page, one of the friends there said they would like to see me do a video on companion planting, what I plant and why I put them together. So that's what this is going to be about, companion planting. Now when I started planning the process for this video, I thought, well, there's just too much information. So this is going to be a 4-part series. In this first part, I'm going to give you kind of a background of companion planting and explain probably the oldest, most well-known companion planting guild out there, and kind of tell you why, if you're a container grower like I am, you don't want to put the guild together in the same container. Part 2, I am going to talk about vegetables that like to be companion planted together. And again, with containers, you're usually not doing that, but there are a few exceptions. So we'll go over those in part 2. Part 3 is going to focus specifically on the herbs that are great companion plants and which ones you need to plant with certain vegetables and which ones you need to keep away from certain vegetables, and whether or not it's okay to put them in the same bucket or whether you need to just have them separated. And part 4 will be just like part 3, except instead of herbs, we're going to cover flowers. So what is companion planting? Well, companion planting uses both science, anecdotal information, and a little art to unite plants in a beneficial combination. Companion planting is a technique based on a long history of observation between plants' interaction out in the garden. But certain combinations of plants can add to or detract to the abundance and the health of the edibles in your garden. There are 3 basic ways that it adds or detracts. First, certain plants will alter the structure of the soil. Secondly, certain plants will attract or repel insects, and those can be bad insects or helpful insects. And third, it can create a helpful microclimate. Companion planting has been used for centuries. Some plant relationships have been scientifically proven, and others have been determined by trial and error and observation over hundreds of years. So let's talk now about what is probably the most well-known companion planting guild, and that would be the Three Sisters Guild. The 3 vegetables that are in the guild are corn, beans, and squash. This Three Sisters combination was developed by the Native Americans centuries ago. In this triad, each plant supports and benefits the other. The corn acts as a trellis for the beans, and those have to be climbing beans, not bush beans, but pole beans. So the corn is the trellis, the beans climb up the corn. Now the beans are also considered nitrogen fixers. Why is that important? Well, corn uses up a lot of nitrogen, depletes the nitrogen from the soil, and the beans are supposed to fix nitrogen in the soil. The bean draws nitrogen from the air and via a symbiotic bacteria converts the nitrogen to plant available form, supposedly boosting the growth of all three vegetables. As I said, the corn stalks form a trellis for the bean vines to climb. And lastly, the rambling squash. Its job with its broad leaves forms a living parasol that densely covers the ground, inhibiting the weeds and keeping the soil cool and moist. Interestingly enough, in the Southwest, there is actually a fourth sister in the guild, the Rocky Mountain bee plant. This 2 to 5 foot tall pink flowered plant is a powerful attractant for beneficial insects that in turn pollinate the beans and the squash. Additionally, the young leaves, flowers, and the seed pods of a bee plant are edible. An interesting side note here, the bee plant produces a lot of iron and is used in making of the very dark pigmented paint that you will find that's characteristic of the Anasazi pottery. Okay, well, having said all that, sounds great, right? We need to talk about why this Three Sisters Guild is not something you want to do in a container, in container planting. Let's talk about each of the different plants. The corn. The corn is supposed to serve as a trellis for the beans. Well, the Native Americans created cultivars of corn that were multi-stalked and shorter and sturdier because it needed to serve as a trellis. And they used corn cultivars like Black Aztec, Hopi White, or the Tarahumara sweet corn. These may or may not do well in your region of the country. So if you're not planting one of these, then you could have corn stalks that are too fragile. I know this for a fact, not because I tried it in containers, but back when we were planting corn in ground, we had one garden bed that we always wanted to plant our corn in. Well, it was depleted of nitrogen after one season. So when I started thinking about that problem, I researched and found the Three Sisters Guild, thinking that adding the beans to the soil would regenerate the nitrogen and I could continue to plant corn in that same bed. It was the sunniest bed in our garden, it was the largest, and we were planting 4 separate rectangular blocks of corn amounting to basically 100 corn plants. Our corn was not the most multi-staked variety, and sure enough, even though I delayed planting the beans 2 weeks like they recommended after the corn, after a few weeks the pole beans pulled the corn stalks down. In growing container corn in the kiddie pool grow system in Walmart bags or grow bags, your corn needs all of the nutrients in that container to grow. There's nothing extra left in that container. Not to mention, if you've grown corn in containers, at the end of the season, when you try to dump that bag, the root system of the corn is so extensive, we have to take a shovel and really go after it to even get the contents out of the bag. We usually end up dumping it in our chicken run for that reason. There's no way we even try to save any of the potting mix in which we've grown the corn. So having said that, if you haven't grown the corn and seen this for yourself, visualize that. You got a 7-gallon bag, the recommended size. You've got 4 corn stalks in that bag. There is no room for beans, and there's certainly no room for squash. So now let's talk about the beans. Well, what kind of beans did the Native Americans use in the Three Sisters Guild? You may be visualizing green beans. like Blue Lake or Kentucky Wonder or another pole type bean. That's not what they were. Now you might be able to use Blue Lake. It might not be too vigorous of a vine, but if you're picking one of these hybrids that has a really strong vine, it's going to pull down your corn. The bean varieties that the Native Americans used were not beans that they ate the green, the pod. The beans they used were where they broke open the pod and actually just ate the bean. All beans are legumes, but when we talk about green beans, we don't separate the pod, right? We're eating the pod and the little bean inside. The beans they used were styles like Four Corners Gold. Here you can see the golden amber bean, and Hopi Light Yellow. And that Hopi Light Yellow is actually a lima bean. It doesn't taste a thing like a green bean. Secondly, the beans are supposed to be a nitrogen fixer that kind of counteracts, puts nitrogen in the soil for that nitrogen taker of the corn. But truthfully, it's not converted to nitrogen in the soil until after it's fully matured, been harvested, died off. At that point, if you yank it up, you're not adding any nitrogen to the soil. So if you want to add nitrogen to the soil in your containers where you're growing beans and use it maybe the next season for your remix for your corn, what you have to do is at the end of the season, cut off the plant, leave the roots in the mix to compost for the rest of the year. And then in the next season, if you want to use that mix for part of your mix that you redo for your corn, then that would be of a benefit if you want to go to that trouble. Okay, so let's talk about the last one, squash. Remember again, what is the purpose of the squash being planted in the rows areas around this little corn mound where the beans are growing up the corn stalk? The purpose of the squash is to protect the ground so that it decreases weeds and to keep the ground moist. Well, in the rain gutter grow system and the kiddie pool grow system, you don't have weeds, which is one of the main reasons that I love it. And the second thing you don't have is you don't have to worry about watering. Now that's assuming you've added the float to the system so it becomes self-watering. But the squash, planted in the same bag as your corn, besides the fact that it would never survive, wouldn't serve those purposes of no weeds and no watering because you don't have it. And the other point I'd like to make about squash, summer squash or the vining winter squash, they get huge. Look at this picture of squash on our RGGS. Guess what? That is 1 month's growth. So in summary, if you're a container grower like I am and you're growing corn in a kiddie pool, in a grow bag, you need to follow the recommendations. In this video here, I'm showing you there are 4 corn planted in one 7-gallon bag. You have 5 bags in a 4-foot pool. But just in case you were thinking, well, 5 bags in that corn pool, I mean, you know, I could squeeze in a bag of squash or I could squeeze in a bag of beans. Well, take a look. In this picture, I was doing a video and you can see behind my shoulder there in the picture, the corn. It is almost 10 foot tall. It's extremely dense. That's 20 corn there in one kiddie pool. The corn is going to shade out anything else you try to put in that pool. Not to mention that it needs airflow. That's why you only put 5 bags in a 4-foot pool. You need to have that airflow. So if you're growing in ground, The corn, the beans, and the squash have a great symbiotic relationship because they're sharing the same soil and they serve different purposes. But in containers, there's no symbiotic relationship in being an above ground neighbor. I hope you enjoyed the intro, and I hope it answered the question about not doing the Three Sisters Guild in a KPGS. Those questions come up every year on Larry's Facebook page, and I believe it did on my group page too last year. So I hope that explains. Stay tuned. The next video will be fun because I will be telling you which vegetables in container growing actually do work really well together. Until next time, remember, bye and have a good one. Said the corn stalks form a trellis for the As I've said, the corn stalk, goodness gracious, that's a lot.